conformity to gender norms is reproduced. But violence also exists in subtle ways that trans scholar Dean Spade would call administrative violence. Administrative violence would include consistently using the wrong pronoun, even though maybe you know better, refusal to provide gender-appropriate clothing, and other such kind of seemingly mundane but humiliating aspects of everyday life. So let's talk a little bit about solitary confinement, or ADSEG, administrative segregation. So within jurisdictions where trans inmates are not housed in facilities that correspond to their gender, they are housed in segregation for their own protection. So this is where the state quite literally forces us back into another kind of closet. Where policies and institutions fail to respond to the vulnerabilities and needs of queer and trans people, solitary confinement becomes the only course of action to prevent harassment and assault by other inmates and staff. But this is in reality, of course, an act of punishment. Extended periods in segregation, and when you get sent to solitary confinement for your own protection, it's generally referred to as administrative segregation. So in the Correctional Services of Canada handbook, which is about this thick, you can go to solitary confinement for two reasons. One is punitive, and one is if you're on suicide watch or if it's for your own protection. Extended periods in solitary confinement take an immense psychological toll on inmates. It increases suicidality and self-harm behaviors. It creates extended periods of suffering, isolation, and loneliness. It prevents engagement in programs such as AA, emotional processing groups. It prevents you from seeing a counselor. Now, many of the examples I've raised so far apply the most clearly to trans women, or in many cases gay men, who are housed in facilities that perpetuate toxic masculinity, such as a men's prison. But let's go back to the three women I spoke about earlier, three queer women in my class. Let's imagine for a second that the one I suspect to be somewhere on the trans spectrum, who sometimes identifies as a woman and sometimes on a particular day identifies as a bro, just imagine that they receive support pre-incarceration for hormone therapy. That's something that they wanted to do. So let's imagine that they appear much more masculine than they would otherwise. It's very likely in this situation that they would have been placed in segregation or at least separated from other women on the unit to prevent sexual relationships. And this is speculation on my part, but it's speculation that's confirmed by discussions with correctional officers. So we're going to take it as a highly likely outcome. So in this sense, we can see again how prisons serve to reproduce the gender binary and punish gender nonconformity. We can also see how ADSEG increases risk for suicide, self-harm, and prevents any type of rehabilitation. So we're going to talk a little bit more about suicide and then move on, I promise. We know that death by suicide and we know that self-harm are the consequences of homophobia and transphobia inside our prisons and in our communities. And once again, we want to see those two things as connected. Research in Ontario has shown that LGBTQ youth in Canada are 14 times more likely to attempt suicide or have a substance abuse problem. We know that queer and trans youth have roughly double the risk for PTSD than their heterosexual and cisgendered peers. And some of the more nuanced research has shown that these mental health problems, especially in trans folks, are the direct result of stigma and discrimination. So trans youth who have access to transition surgery, where that's what they want, that's what they desire, and those who are able to change their provincial identification have much lower rates of suicide. Thus, correctional policies that refuse to adopt and allow for medically necessary procedures and other forms of trans support are in many ways signing death certificates for those inmates. Let's consider a recent and very difficult case in Georgia in the United States where trans inmate Ashley Diamond was refused hormone therapy and gender reassignment surgery even though she'd been on hormone therapy for 17 years prior to her incarceration. She was sexually assaulted 8 times while being placed in a men's facility, and she attempted to castrate herself and later attempted suicide. And I say this not to shock you, but simply to drive the point home that changing policies in how our prisons work is a life or death issue. Although there are not many cases like Ashley's in Canada, we must be steadfast and brave in pushing for a queer approach to justice that acknowledges the trauma of homophobic and transphobic violence that lands queer people in prison in the first place. Hurt people hurts people. It's simple to say, much more difficult to apply to a justice system that is structured according to moral dichotomies that erase the complexity of our experiences with violence, power, and harm. And there also remain significant challenges to advocating for trans inmates. And this is something that I've struggled with a lot in my academic work. So there was a very recent case just a couple of weeks ago in New Brunswick, where we were notified by a correctional officer who is an ally that a trans woman was being incarcerated in a provincial facility. And they were worried about their safety and wanted to draw some attention to it. We mobilized, we got media attention, journalists got Howard Sapers, the correctional investigator, on the phone, and we were ready to run a story when we found out that the actual charge in her case was that of first-degree murder. And it was a fairly high-profile case, which left us feeling that this was not the test case for trans rights in prisons in New Brunswick, because murder cases bring out the most punitive and retributive impulses in the general public. So we thought it would actually harm our cause and also potentially harm this offender's case because they hadn't even went to trial yet and the public didn't know they were trans. But despite challenges for advocacy and despite the somewhat troubling and disturbing situation of trans and homophobic violence in Canadian jails, I think that there are some concrete ways in which we can move towards queer prison justice. And I think the first one is that our federally appointed correctional investigator, Howard Sapers, or whoever replaces him in the future, must immediately engage the work of queer and trans advocacy organizations to include the mention of queer and trans people as minorities that are overrepresented in the prison system, and this must be noted in all official reports. Because federal and provincial jails make it so difficult for faculty researchers to do the type of research we need on sexual assault and queer experience in jail, the Ombudsman's Office must make it their mandate to do so. We need data to support a movement for prison justice. We must also recognize that the continued silence of the Ombudsman's Office to include data on sexual minorities in prison is an expression of homophobia. A sincere commitment to collecting more and better data on queer and trans prison experiences will help us build the critical movements that we need to tackle the prison industrial complex and the ways in which it's entangled in bigger systems of gendered oppression. 2, we have poor Howard a break. I would like to call upon the Elizabeth Fry Society and the John Howard Society to begin a dialogue on how to better advocate for gender non-conforming inmates. When our prison advocacy organizations and not-for-profit organizations are structured according to the gender binary, they're failing to protect queer people, which is ultimately unjust. There has been a troubling trend of transphobia in women's advocacy groups, some of whom are fighting against having trans women housed in women's facilities. I have read editorials from the UK, the US, and Canada that argue that trans women are just men in women's clothing, or one editorial that wrote wolves in sheep's clothing, trying to get into women's jails to take advantage of and sexually assault female offenders. This is deeply disturbing. It's deeply transphobic, and it needs to be called out and no longer tolerated in feminist advocacy circles. I would also like to call upon the Elizabeth Fry Societies across Canada to engage trans advocacy groups in learning about and posting education systems on the risks that trans women of color face for sexual violence, especially within prisons. Leadership in these prominent feminist organizations and in organizations like John Howard must denounce transphobia and accept that trans women are women, trans men are men. 3, this is the one that's closest to my heart. I would like to see a move towards trauma-informed correctional practice. Raise your hand if you know what trauma-informed practice means. Someone want to give an explanation about trauma-informed practice? Yes, go ahead.
It's basically understanding the different traumatic experiences that individuals you deal with are coming from. So, for example, if you're a lawyer, you understand that certain things might trigger your client, certain backgrounds having cultural competency, understanding that different people have different responses based on where they come from and the experiences that they've been through.
Yeah, very good. A+. Yeah, the most important thing about trauma-informed practice, and as it would apply in a correctional setting, is that it reframes the notion of risk and the notion of security. So you would no longer be allowed to see an offender as posing a risk to the general population. You would see the risk as coming from you and impacting them in a way that makes them vulnerable. So it completely reshapes the way in which we think about vulnerability in our practice, and it would make correctional officers and prison staff more attentive to their power in their work with inmates. Now, this is easier said than done. Our prisons are a mess, especially after the last 2 federal governments we've had, but I think it's something we can definitely move towards. And in many cases, so secure mental health facilities often function, they're architecturally and in policy the same as prisons in the way that they work, the way that they negotiate risk. Instead of solitary confinement, they call it TQ or therapeutic quiet, but there are essentially solitary confinement units in mental health wards. Now, cases like the Rehtaeh Parsons case, for example, where there was a lot of public outcry over the ways in which she was forcibly strip-searched after a suicide attempt by male orderlies, and this is something her family protested against. In response, the IWK Health Center has implicated, or they've started a process of moving towards trauma-informed practice with their staff. And in other hospitals across the country, where this has been successful, they no longer need to use TQ. They have different strategies and different ways of working with folks living on the unit that doesn't involve locking them up in a room with a camera on them and having them in social isolation. So we can assume that if we can do it correctly in hospitals to reduce solitary confinement, it may work in maximum security units. 4, I think we need a change in federal correctional policy so that administrative segregation is no longer the go-to solution for the protection of an inmate. And I think trauma-informed practice will help us. I think it will help us get to a point where protecting each other doesn't mean locking us in our room and putting us on a really terrible timeout. 5, all provinces should follow Ontario's lead in allowing trans inmates to choose the facility they feel most comfortable in. Once again, this will really reduce the use of solitary confinement if the provincial policies change and offenders are given some say over where they're incarcerated. 6, I think is one of the most important ones. We need to improve gender and sexuality education at all levels of society and invest in shelters, social services, mental health and addictions exclusively for queer and trans youth and adults. And that is functioning at the level where we will be preventing incarceration. And 7, I urge all of us to take up queer positions of analysis in our personal and professional lives and make a mess of dichotomous concepts that make tidy and simple moral judgments out of what is ultimately a very messy landscape of social power, violence, and harm. If we can dismantle the way the gender binary structures our consciousness, I think that we can dismantle systems of oppression that force us into closets and segregation units. A queer approach to justice could transform our system into one that puts healing and liberation at the center of a collective pursuit of a better world.
So we have time for some questions now, if anybody has any for Ardath.